Here I picked the 4 states I think that most of us are from that are joining this webinar today: Idaho, Montana, Nevada, and Utah. And just to give you a sense of what at least the 2020 fire season looked like. And fires are definitely impacting our rangelands, our forests, and other systems throughout our 4-state region. So, thinking about how weeds respond to fire and how we may think about managing weeds in the context of fire has always been important, and I foresee it becoming even more important in the future. So who am I? Well, I am a weed ecologist. I am not a fire ecologist. So I think about how plants grow and how they interact with each other, in particular, noxious weeds and invasive plants. And I'm also an extension specialist. So there's a lot of times I'm, out across Montana, some of our other neighboring states, talking about invasive plant and noxious weed management. And it's just with fires being as on a lot of people's minds these days, I do get a lot of questions about this topic. So I'm not an expert on fire, but I do know something about plants, and in particular invasive plants. And what I'll try to do during the course of this presentation is kind of give you some generalizations, because fire is complicated and plant ecology and weed ecology is complicated as well. And when you cross those two, there aren't any easy answers, right? The way weeds and fire interact is going to be site specific. And you as a manager or an educator who's giving management recommendations to people, what I would like to do today is to give you some things to think about and some generalizations, so that when you do need to make some of those site specific decisions, you can do those as well informed as possible. So these are the 4 topics that I would like to touch upon today. I do want to mention that we do have, MSU Extension has this Managing Weeds After Wildfire publication, and this presentation is structured around that publication. So if this is some topic that you're really interested in and you want a little bit more information, or you want a resource that you can share with your clients, you can access this. You can get hard copies, or you can access it online. And I think Noelle will be putting a link to that publication in at the beginning of the presentation, and as well at the end. We'll revisit that. And this publication is pretty much everything I know about managing weeds after wildfire. So let's get into this and start off by talking about fire effect on plants, okay? Just plants in general. So when there's a fire on the landscape, whether it's, forested system, shrub steppe, grasslands, whatever it might be, you get an increase in nutrients, water, and light following fire. And these are all essential resources for plant growth. So in the part of the world where we live, most of our species are adapted to fire, and they tend to take advantage of fire. So this increase in nutrients, water, and light happens for a couple reasons. The first reason is you just have a pulse and resource supply. If you think about a fire burning up a bunch of vegetation, the ash that is a result of that burning is just sitting there on the surface of the soil, and it's nutrient rich. It's waiting for plants to take advantage of it. At the same time, you have a decline in resource uptake by plants, right? Because nothing's growing there immediately after the fire. So this combination of the pulse of, because all the vegetation's burned up, and then the decline in plants actually using those essential resources makes for a situation where you have a lot of resources available. And when you think about plants responding to that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our species are adapted to fire on the landscape at different intervals, of course, but you can get a big flush in vegetation following a fire, whether it's good vegetation or bad vegetation. Many, many species are going to respond positively to fire, okay? So let's break this down a little bit more and think about native plants or even non-native but non-weedy plants that might show up after a fire versus weedy plants that might show up. So if you think about kind of, we'll call them colonizing plants, they typically have a high growth rate, they produce a lot of seeds, they do well in high resource environments, and they dominate following a disturbance. Well, as a weed ecologist and someone who studies weeds all the time, if you look at some of the traits of weeds, they're exactly the same as those of colonizing plants. So weeds act like weeds, right? They're going to take advantage of this disturbance. Weeds like disturbed areas. So let's think about this a little bit more in terms of how might a weedy invasive plant respond to fire differently than maybe just what we would call a colonizing plant. And I'd like to draw upon some research that was done in Montana quite a few years, almost 20 years ago now. This was a situation where a prescribed fire was occurring in kind of a grassland foothills in southwestern Montana, and Dalmatian toadflax was growing there. And the researchers took advantage of these prescribed fires by looking at how the fire affected Dalmatian toadflax in burned areas and then in adjacent areas that were not part of the prescribed fire. So on this graph, we're looking at the biomass of Dalmatian toadflax at 3 different sites. And then the fiery bar is those plots where the fire had occurred, and then the gray bar is a paired plot where the fire didn't occur. And at 2 out of the 3 sites, there was a statistically significant difference in the biomass of Dalmatian toadflax. At this first site, it was about 110% increase in biomass as a result of burning. At site 3, it was over a 300% increase in biomass of Dalmatian toadflax. So toadflax biomass increased at 2 of the 3 sites. The researchers also looked at the effect of fire on seed production of Dalmatian toadflax. So here we're looking at the number of seeds per plant across these same 3 sites. And at all 3 sites, there was a fairly dramatic increase in seed production. Here's about 350 seeds per plant in the burned areas versus just 7 seeds per plant on a Dalmatian toadflax plant in the non-burned. Site 3, we're about 1,300 seeds per plant versus about 30 seeds per plant. So Dalmatian toadflax really took advantage of this disturbance and increased in biomass and increased in its seed production. Now, I was said earlier that many plants respond positively to fire, right? The researchers also looked at the effect of the fire on grass biomass. And this site, if I remember correctly, was mostly blue bunch wheatgrass and Idaho fescue. So kind of a typical grassland site of many areas of the western states, especially Montana. At 2 of the 3 sites, site 1 and site 3 again, the biomass of grass increased as well. Okay, this was about a 75% increase. This is about a 60% increase. Now, if you remember, Dalmatian toadflax biomass was about 110% increase, and I think over 300% increase in site 3. So the grass is responding as well, but if there's an invasive plant present, the invasive plant the magnitude of that positive response will probably be greater, okay? So I think the question becomes, after a fire, what sort of colonization are you going to get? Is it going to be native plants, native colonizers, or is it going to be something weedy and invasive. In this case, just a picture of common tansy. So how you answer that question, or I guess some information we could use to help us have a better answer to this question, has to do with a couple different things. And it has to do with noxious weeds prior to the fire and the burn severity. So how severely did the fire burn? And those two things can interact to determine whether natural recovery is possible, or if you're going to have to make some more drastic management decisions and get in there and do some more aggressive management. So this is the second part of the information I'd like to cover today, and let's get into this a little bit. So I encourage you to know your enemy, right? The noxious weed location and abundance pre-fire is very helpful to know what to expect post-fire, okay? If you're in a situation, and we'll get into an exception to this later on in the presentation, but weeds don't just show up because fire happened, right? If you're in a situation where you didn't have a lot of weeds, or maybe no weeds before the fire, it's not likely that weeds are going to be a big problem after the fire. If you had a lot of weeds prior to the fire, then it's going to be more of an issue post-fire. So the first thing you need to do is know your enemy. What sort of invasive plant or noxious weed was present, and at what abundance prior to the fire? So that's one thing that is helpful to know as you try to determine if a site's going to recover in a way that is satisfactory in terms of not having too many weeds and still being a functioning plant community with desired species. The second thing that needs to be considered is how severe the fire burned. And this is where I want to reiterate that I am not a fire ecologist, and fire is a very complicated thing. But what we can do as people who aren't fire ecologists is kind of look at different aspects or different things you might see out on the ground, like the soil, duff and debris, ash color, small fuels, hydrophobicity. You can look at these elements out on the ground after the fire to try to assess how severe the burn was, okay? So, and this table is actually in that extension publication that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, but there's some different descriptors that you see, like for soil. The color of the soil can indicate the severity, whether it's low, medium, and high. The ash color can do that as well, low severity, medium severity, high severity. What sort of shrubs or stumps or small fuels remain, and what do they look like after the fire? So one thing you'll want to do if you're trying to assess an area after fire and you're worried about weeds is try to do an assessment of how severe the burn was, all right? Now, where this fits in to whether or not natural recovery is likely and how big of an issue weeds are going to be is we kind of cross these two factors, noxious weed abundance and severity of the fire. And we've come up with a table here, kind of this matrix. So degree of noxious weed cover on the left from absent to very high, and then burn severity running from left to right, low, medium, and high. If you're working in an area where noxious weed cover was either absent to moderate cover before the fire, and the fire severity is low to medium, you can see that natural recovery is likely, and you may need to do some weed management, especially if you get into areas where you get what we're calling moderate noxious weed cover, okay? And we'll talk more about this column when we are later in the presentation and talking about management. So you're really concerned about weeds if you're high severity burns and high noxious weed or invasive plant cover. All right, if you're in here, you still need to do some weed management, but those other plants, the non-weedy plants, are going to come back well as well. So I want to share another study with you that came out of the Bitterroot fires that burned in 2000. And this was an iconic photo from that year. It was a really big fire year in Western Montana. And this was, I think this photo showed up, you know, in some of the national press. And following this fire, there were some researchers that went out to sites post-fire, and they looked at the occurrence of spotted knapweed in 71 different stands. These were forested stands, and across these different stands, they measured spotted knapweed occurrence in almost 300 different plots. And they followed these plots for 1 year post-fire, 3 years post-fire, and 5 years post-fire. And they categorized these plots as being in low, medium, or high severity burns. And there's a lot of data here, but I think there are, again, some generalizations that we can draw from this study. And one of them is that at low severity burns, weeds are present at first, but they don't necessarily increase or persist. So if you look at, this is the total across all 280 some plots, and you know, it includes these different forest stands. Year one, 43% of the plots they measured had spotted knapweed. Year three, 39% of those plots had spotted knapweed occurring. And at year 5, 18% did. So there's a general decline. The knapweed is there initially. It's taking advantage of that disturbance. But as the other species come back and a little bit slower, you may see less knapweed over time at low severity. At medium to high severity, it's kind of the opposite. Weeds are not as prevalent at first, but they tend to increase over time. And let's think about this a little bit so it makes sense in our heads. If you have a medium to high severity burn, everything is burned up. You know, you might have killed plants with the fire. You may have killed seeds that were either on plants or in the top surface of the soil at very high severity burns. So everything is just slower to come back. But that disturbance is fairly intense. So even the weeds are slow to come back. But because the disturbance was as severe as it was, you may end up seeing more weeds longer term. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So that's a second generalization that we can draw from this study. A third one is that some plant communities are just more vulnerable to weed invasion following fire than others. In this case, you know, we're thinking about spotted knapweed, and the Doug fir, the lower elevation, a little bit drier forest stands, were more susceptible to spotted knapweed invasion following fire than the higher elevation, wetter systems. Okay, so let's just kind of summarize this. Burn severity and noxious weeds. If you're in low severity, increase in seeds initially, but those weeds don't necessarily increase or become a big problem over time. High severity burns, you might see fewer weeds initially, but there's a faster rate of increase, and the weeds may persist longer. And then it does depend on the plant community. Higher elevation and wetter is typically less concerning than lower elevation and drier. Now, I'm showing you data from forested systems, you know, fairly high elevation, fairly wet. If you got into like ponderosa pine systems or even grassland systems, weeds may be a bigger issue because they're lower elevation and they're drier. Okay, so this information, you know, came from that study where they monitored these plots for 5 years following big fire year. I have visited with our forestry extension specialist, Peter Kolb, about some work that he has done in the Bitterroot Valley. He has some plots in the area that he's been following for 20 years since the 2000 fires. And his data is interesting. It's more variable. It's harder to draw these generalizations from. But one of the takeaways from his work is that if weeds were there initially, that's where weeds are going to be now, okay? And it goes back to this idea of, knowing what you have for weeds pre-fire, and having done that work over the years and knowing what you have on the ground is a really good way for you to think about where you need to go post-fire and where you need to invest your time and energy into managing weeds, okay? Another generalization that I'd like to make at this time is just, this is some generalizations about high-risk invasive plants or noxious weeds. And this is summarized across, many studies that have been done in the Western US. Some of those categories of species that are considered high risk are resprouting perennial forbs, things like Dalmatian toadflax, Canada thistle, okay? Those have been shown to be more problematic after fire than forbs that might have to generate from seed, okay? Maybe spotted knapweed would be a good example, right? It doesn't have the creeping roots that, it has more of a tap root. It doesn't have the creeping roots that can respond more quickly after a fire. Another category is forbs capable of long distance dispersal. Now, one that sticks in my head is Canada thistle. It's got these seeds that have a pappus on them and they can blow all over the place. So if you have Canada thistle really increasing in one area after the fire, because it's a resprouting perennial forb, think about how far those seeds could move to create new infestations somewhere else. And then the last high risk weed is the annual grasses, something like cheatgrass. And I want to talk just briefly about cheatgrass because we have an audience here that's I think mostly across a 4-state region, and we've seen cheatgrass do slightly different things depending on where you are in this region. So cheatgrass has been a big problem in the Great Basin area, Nevada, Utah, southern Idaho for many, many years, for decades. And we know that when cheatgrass invades an area, mostly we're talking grasslands and shrublands here, you get an increase in the quantity and continuity of fuel, okay? That cheatgrass forms a nice layer or carpet of fuel that helps fires carry farther. So it's very flammable, it's easily lit on fire by something like lightning. And when it does start on fire, you can get larger and more frequent fires. And if those fires are burning too frequently, our perennial species may not be able to recover. I started this presentation by saying, plants generally respond well to fire, at least plants in this region where we live. But if fire starts burning too often, it becomes harder and harder for those species to recover. So those perennial species are unable to recover. And then what do you get in place of those species that can't recover? You get more cheatgrass, which again increases the continuity and quantity of highly flammable fuel. So this is what we've seen in portions of the Western US. It's become a big issue for growth at our wildland urban interface in terms of threatening homes and human safety. This cheatgrass fire cycle, has been documented in, as I said, Idaho, southern Idaho, Utah, Nevada. It hasn't really been documented in Montana, and I'll share some data with you here in a little bit to talk more about that. Okay, moving on in the presentation, we're about halfway through, and we're next going to talk about fire suppression and weeds, all right? So fire suppression and fire suppression activities and weeds. And I'm going to start by telling you a little story. okay? So this is a picture of a segment of one of MSU's research ranches. This is Red Bluff Research Ranch, west of Bozeman, about 30 miles. And there was a wildfire that burned through this area in 2012. And it created a situation here where we had a burned area, a non-burned area, and then they had dug this fire line. Well, they didn't dig, but they used a dozer, you know, to scrape off the vegetation in the soil along this fire break. Now, there's cheatgrass at our Red Bluff Research Ranch. And some of my colleagues here at MSU took this opportunity to see how cheatgrass would respond to fire. We had just talked about it, you know, in other parts of the West, but we don't know as much about it here in Montana. So they went out to this site and they established, you know, they sampled the plant community in the burned area, the non-burned area, and the fire break. And they did that for 1, 2, and 3 years after the fire. And here's what their data showed. So this is looking at cheatgrass cover 1, 2, and 3 years post-fire. So 2013, 14, and 15. The green line is the area that wasn't burned, so uphill from the fire line. The black is the burned area, and then this kind of reddish color is the bulldozer line. And it's fairly easy to see that you got the most cheatgrass in the places where the greatest disturbance had occurred. This bulldozer line, the fire break that had been created. Here's a photo of that fire break. This was I think 4 years after the fire. Burned over here. You can see the skeletons of the burned trees. Non-burned over here. And here's that dozer line coming up this ridge line, and all this light brown, fluffy looking stuff is cheatgrass. Looks like there's cheatgrass back there too, but that's a different story, okay? So, you know, cheatgrass was the biggest problem because of the thing that we had done to fight this fire. Okay, so that was 1, 2, and 3 years post-fire. Well, just this past summer, we had one of our online master's students, Isaac Newell. He resampled these plots that the other researchers had sampled, you know, 9 years previously. This is data that Isaac and his advisor, Lisa Rue, collected for his professional paper. And it's presented a little bit differently than what I just showed you, but here's, you know, no unburned, burned, and then the bulldozer line. And we're looking at log scale here. So when you think about cover of cheatgrass, you know, you have to think about this in a little different way. Just look here to see, are we seeing differences across these 3 areas 9 years post-fire? There's still the lowest amount of cheatgrass in the unburned, but now the burned and the bulldozed line are more similar to each other 9 years post-fire. Here's some more data from Isaac's paper. He looked at the 5 most abundant species in these areas. And if you look at the unburned area, cheatgrass is showing up as the 3rd most abundant species. It was at about 10% cover, averaged across all the frames where he collected data. In the burned area, it's also the 3rd most abundant species, but it's a little higher cover. In that bulldozed line, cheatgrass is the most abundant species at about 35% cover across all the plots that he measured. So it's still hanging in there, but we are seeing more evening out in terms of, and it's really, you know, cheatgrass does appear to be increasing across the ranch, but it's still the highest in this site that was very much disturbed with this bulldozer line. So if you're thinking about weed management after fire, and you have disturbances on the landscape associated with wildfire suppression, I would tell you to go there first. So focus your management here, things like fuel breaks or fire lines. Were there equipment staging areas, you know, where there was a lot of traffic and equipment was being moved around, and maybe vegetation all got trampled, and maybe new species got introduced, being carried in on people and their gear. Also, where was fire retardant dropped? I'll show you a little bit, just say a little bit more about that in the next slide. And in these situations, these would be the places where you would want to monitor and see what's coming back, you know, the first year post-fire. Treat, if necessary, you know, herbicides, targeted grazing, and maybe revegetation. So one thing I would like to say, you know, I mentioned fire retardant, but there has been some research, but also just anecdotally, that things like cheatgrass tend to increase where fire retardant is dropped. And this makes sense if you think about plant ecology, because there's actually nutrients in this fire retardant, ammonium phosphate, right? Ammonium, phosphorus, and weeds like nutrients. So they like that fertilizer, and you might see an increase in weedy species where that fire retardant has been dropped, okay? So that's all I'm really gonna say about fire suppression activities. And I wanna move to the last topic for this presentation, fire as an opportunity. I always like to end on a positive note. I think that, you know, as much as we worry about weeds after fire, fire can also provide an opportunity to have some very effective noxious weed or invasive plant management. So let's talk about that a little bit, and where am I coming from with this idea? It's primarily with chemical control. If you're thinking about using herbicides to control weeds, after fire is a great time to do that. Weeds are going to be some of the first species that green up again, and they're going to be very visible because a lot of litter has been burned up, and other vegetation. For example, this picture of common tansy growing here, you can see this, you know, last year's stems, but all that re-sprouting perennial forb, those new fresh leaves are very visible on the landscape. So they're very visible, so you might be able to see them where you would not have noticed them before. And then because there's not a lot of plant litter left to intercept a herbicide application, you can get enhanced effectiveness of herbicide applications post-fire, all right? So I think if you're using herbicides to manage weeds, you know, post-fire is an opportunity to get even better control than you might otherwise get. A lot of people ask about, well, what about biocontrol? What if I've put biocontrol out there to control weeds? Do they die? Do they get burned up in the fire? What happens? And this is one of those places where a scientist gets to say it depends, because it really does depend. It depends on the size and uniformity of the burn, as well as the timing of wildfire in relation to the insect's life cycle. So if the fire occurs during a time when the insects were in maybe a below ground portion of their life cycle, they may not have been impacted by the fire at all, especially if it was a low severity fire and the soils didn't heat up very much. Also, if the wildfire was patchy in severity and you kind of get this mosaic of burned and unburned areas, the insects can move, you know, they fly, they crawl, they can still find protection and food if you're in a situation like that, and they can survive that. So just a few words there about biological control. Another aspect of noxious weed management that I want to mention is cultural control, or more specifically revegetation. Do I need to revegetate following a fire? And for this, I want to take us back to this kind of this matrix table that we talked about in the first quarter of the presentation, or the second quarter, I guess, where we're looking at degree of weed cover relative to burn severity. Now, earlier we were talking about natural recovery, and we were hanging out in this portion of the table. If here we're hanging on the fringes of high burn severity and high noxious weed cover. And this is really the situation where you would want to think about putting some seed down and doing some revegetation, especially if it's high severity and high weed cover. And again, fire might present an opportunity because fire it can be just a naturally occurring seed bed preparation. It burns the litter up. You got a nice kind of fluffy layer of soil and ash that provide a good seed bed for species that you might seed after the fire. If you do revegetate though, know what you're getting into, okay? There's more and more evidence that post-fire seeding can have lasting effects on the composition of a plant community. So in other words, what you seed post-fire can be there for a long time. And that means you want to make sure you're seeding species that will meet your long-term management objectives. So there's a lot of things to consider with revegetation. It'd be a topic for another webinar. And I think actually it has been a topic on this webinar series in the past. But understand that what you're doing seeding wise can have lasting effects on the plant community. And I would say if revegetation, if you're limited where you can do it and where you can't, focus on these high priority areas first. Again, going back to kind of these areas where maybe our fire suppression activities have been more intense than other areas. The last thing I want to say that ties to management weed management after fire is just monitoring and the importance of monitoring. If you have a late summer fire, and things are greening up some in the fall, try to get out there in the fall, but at a minimum, get out there early during the following growing season to see what the vegetation is looking like, what's coming back, and what might be coming back that looks problematic. So try to even do that on an annual basis after the first year. These plant communities are going to take time to recover after a fire. It's not all going to happen in the first year. So if you can get out there in subsequent summers, that's good as well. And pay special attention, again, to these highly disturbed areas. Sometimes with fire, or more recently with fire and drought, there's, a lot of hay gets moved around because people need hay or they need forage for their livestock because there's nothing left on the ground. Just a couple comments about donated hay, some best management practices. If you did get donated hay, try to learn as much as you can about where that hay came from and what weeds it may be part of that hay. Also, feed that hay in limited areas that you have easy access to in case you do need to get in there longer term to monitor for weeds and control any new weeds showing up that you didn't have before. Okay, so take home points. I know that was a lot of information, and here's some, I'll hit the highlights here with these take home points. Fire stimulates growth of plants, both good and bad, all right? It's not just weeds. The good plants will respond positively as well. Consider noxious weed abundance and burn severity to develop that post-fire management plan. Remember that fire suppression activities can increase weeds, so prioritize those areas if you're limited in the amount of time and resources you have to get out there. And then remember that fire can actually provide an opportunity for noxious weed management. So take advantage of that if you're in a situation where you've really wanted to get a very effective herbicide application down, or you want to do some careful monitoring and think about where you might selectively revegetate. Fire can actually serve as an opportunity. So with that, I will try to address any questions. My contact information is listed there. This is the website. And then I will also mention again that we do have this extension publication that is available both hard copy or electronically. And hopefully Noel is getting that link into the chat box as we wrap this up. I will stop sharing because I think that allows me to see the chat box a little better, and also gives you an opportunity maybe to see my face a little bit better. And we'll see what we can do for any questions.
Jane.
Yes.
I saw one question come through the chat box for you. Are you ready? This is a good one.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the idea of propagating genetically modified weeds to breed into a wild population to help weaken the weed's seed tolerance to fire? Isn't that a good question?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, I never turned down the idea of like thinking about how science and technology might help us address weed problems. I don't know. What do I think of this idea? I think it's worth contemplating, but I want to do it very carefully. I'm not aware of any research or anything in practice that's happening within that realm. If anybody else is, you know, please share ideas. One thought, you know, sometimes similar questions come up in the realm of like revegetation of range and wildlands. You know, we're dealing with very large acreages that sometimes don't have a lot of like economic profitability. And my understanding, at least right now, and I haven't kept up with the literature as well on this topic, is that this idea hasn't been developed as much in these range and wildland systems because the economic profitability, the return on that is not as high. So, you know, a lot of that work tends to be done in croplands where return on investment is realized perhaps a little easier. But this is like genetically modified weeds. I don't know. That's a good question. I see Noel, you said great question, John. I'll save that one for the end. I'm sorry, John, that's all I got for you.
Thanks, Jane. That was a hard one. Yeah, I definitely saved that one for you.
That's more, to me, it seems like we need to have a discussion about that. And there'd probably be a lot of philosophy thrown about in that discussion.
I encourage too, if people have more questions, put them in the chat. We don't have a ton in there. Jane, you must have just explained it all perfectly. I mean,
I don't know about that. I see Dave mentions the real challenge in his area, which I know Dave, so it's far western Montana, is encouraging the largest land management agency to address some of these principles in managing weeds after wildfire. And yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, it takes a lot of resources, meaning, you know, manpower and money and equipment on the ground to implement these ideas everywhere. I think that's where the prioritization becomes very important. But yeah, it's a challenge for everybody. Yeah, Dave just said the budgets don't allow for long-term monitoring. Yeah, for sure. I mean, none of us are good at long-term monitoring. Even if you think about the research we do, it's usually 2 or 3 year projects. You know, it's a rare opportunity when somebody monitors something for longer than that. We're seeing more and more of that, and we need more and more of it, but it needs to be longer than 2 years. Especially like with the revegetation and, you know, the natural recovery. Yeah. Oh, I see. Noel, I am kind of keeping up with this, so I'll just try to tackle them. But if I miss something, please point that out. I see Lynn is asking, how do we judge when livestock can be returned to rangelands after wildfire? There's actually a section in this publication that talks about that. It kind of depends on the plant community, the region or the system that you're working within, and how well those predominant or those dominant species respond to fire. But you know, it used to be I think it was just you kept grazing off for a couple years, but that idea has been it is more nuanced than that, and there's research, you know, more recent research that suggests we could perhaps graze the first year after fire, again depending on the system that you're working in, and like if you waited to do that grazing until the end of the growing season, so you give all the I'm thinking grasses mostly here, you give those perennial grasses a chance to grow back, have a full summer of growth, produce seeds, drop those seeds before you would come in and then do some grazing, and you're basically grazing off the you know, the standing litter from that season's growth, and you may not have it may not be detrimental to the system. Let's see.
Here, Jane, do you want me to?
Yeah.
There's more popping up.
Yeah.
So one question that came up in the chat is, so the BLM plan for fire breaks across the West will definitely encourage weed growth? Good question.
Yeah. I think many of those fire breaks get seeded. Those would be like the places that actually get seeded back after a fire. So it's a tricky situation, right? Because you're putting in a fire break to keep the fire from getting any bigger, but at the same time, that fire break could be a linear vector of weed invasion. I think that's where the combination of, you know, that's where revegetation could come in, and they would be like the high priority areas to make sure you're getting some seed down on the ground. It's my guess is some of those fire breaks get seeded to kind of fast growing, shorter lived species that could potentially compete with something like cheatgrass that's going to try to show up in that fire break.
All right, I've got another one for you.
Mm-hmm.
Any data on post-fire pre-emergent herbicide treatment? It will kill the cheatgrass, but does it kill all the natives also? Any
data on post-fire pre-emergent? I wonder if this is specifically thinking about the active ingredient indaziflam, perhaps. That's a new herbicide that's out there for dealing with cheatgrass and other annual grasses. Yes, so what we know about that herbicide so far is that if that's the one that, well, and a lot of pre-emergents are non-selective, actually, for that matter. They don't care if they're killing weed seeds or, you know, perennial native grass seeds. They're gonna take those little seedlings out when they try to germinate from the seed. So it can kill natives coming back if they're trying to come back from seed. If they're coming back from a perennial root mass, you know, they're resprouting, they should be able to grow through that pre-emergent herbicide layer. But if something's trying to come back from seed and that seed is in the top inch or so of the soil where the herbicide is hanging out, it can be impacted. Yeah. And Dan, I don't have any data on that myself, but there is work going on in that arena in, you know, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho.
All right, here's another one for you. Money is an issue in so many of these issues or areas. Are there some resources such as universities, FFA, scouts, etc., that we could start building cooperative efforts with to help with monitoring?
Yeah, that looks like it's coming from Mitchell. I say try all those places. You know, one opportunity that comes into my mind right away, especially with post-fire situations, is the NRCS does have programs that are post-fire that can help with monitoring, treatments, etc. And, you know, sometimes the NRCS, like, they're looking for you to, like, for the applicant for those programs to be partnering with adjacent landowners, other organizations like conservation districts. Sometimes the universities are involved. So I think just, I would look to NRCS as one source that has programs in place. But then, you know, be thinking about your contacts and your network and the people that you interact with to see how you might build those cooperative efforts. I see there's a message there from John. Hopefully we're working through them mostly in order.
Yeah, that's the next one I was going to ask you.
Okay, yeah, John has an interesting situation. Areas affected by coal seam fires. How frequently do fires need to be for damage to native grasses to occur? You know, John, I don't think there's an easy answer there. It would, you know, even if you think about, okay, let's just assume you're in a grassland setting that has, you know, 5 dominant grass species. Even among those 5 dominant grass species, each one would respond kind of differently to fire. And, you know, and the fire frequency. It could also, you know, the season at which a fire burns can really affect how well, like, a grassland community comes back after the fire. If it's burning, you know, in late summer, fall, or early spring, when the grasses aren't very actively growing, it has less impact than if it, you know, it comes through midsummer or even early summer. So I think, John, I think there's a lot of nuances to that question that, like, I couldn't just give you an easy answer like, oh, if it burns every 5 years, you're going to have a problem. Great question, though.
I've got a comment from farther back in the chat that you could respond to maybe. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think all of these principles apply to people in our northern Nevada area who clear their 5 to 10 acres because they don't like the sage, kind of like a disturbance.
Oh, yeah.
Similarity.
So do you get the sense that that comment is like the clearing of the sage could be similar to a fire?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that actually Noelle and I were having a conversation earlier today about when people want to get rid of native plants. And, you know, and it's understandable. I could see people wanting to get rid of sage on their small acreage. But, you know, the question you got to ask is, if you're going to get rid of that sage, what's going to take its place? Because the sage is no longer there using those resources, the water, the nutrients, the light. So look around and kind of think about, okay, what could potentially invade if I take this very dominant species out of my plant community. And then I see Allison shared a comment here as well. I know Allison, she's in kind of central Montana, southwestern to central. NRCS, FSA, Conservation District, and the Weed District have been great with post-fire recovery here and obtaining funds to help. Yeah, in Montana, we have the weed districts can get emergency funding for noxious weed related problems, including problems post-wildfire. Steve, says his casual post-fire surveys have been conducted from fire breaks. Your work suggests that my observations from those strolls may be biased. Am I to further read that you see a lot of weeds in those post-fire strolls? And if you're saying yes, then I think it could be a little biased. You got to walk off the fire break a little ways and see, throw some frames, collect some data, see what you think. Steve says, oh yes, many weeds. What's interesting about those fire breaks, if you think long term, if those fire breaks are a linear infestation across a landscape, they can actually serve as, you know, the weeds and the seeds being produced within that fire break could keep moving away from that fire break. So, you know, it's interesting to think about how those fire breaks could be the start of, you know, a larger landscape invasion, especially if the vegetation is not that healthy outside the fire break.
It looks like we're all caught up on questions in the chat. For you, Jane, I think this one might be for Mayor, which is, oh yeah. Hi, Mayor.
Hey, yeah, so Jane, one of the questions, Nevada has a 10-question quiz using your content for the CEU credits. And the very first question, I believe, was plants take up nutrients after fire, true or false?
True.
Okay, and I guess maybe whoever made the quiz did it wrong, because the correct answer that they said was false. So Curtis, if you're still online, I put in an email in chat. So email this person, Chad Morris from Nevada, and let him know. So I hope everyone else was able to get the CEU link and the evaluation link in chat. And yeah, and Brianna as well, please email Chad Morris. Maybe we can, sounds like everyone is maybe good to go. Not seeing any more comments in chat. Thanks, Noelle, and for handling the questions, and Jane, that presentation was wonderful. There was one question, is this recorded? Yes, it's recorded. And contact the person that sent you the invitation to the webinar, and they'll be able to provide the link to you in a few days. So I'm gonna stop that. And yes, we